and always know in which direction we're praying. Be careful what you wish for, but be certain what you pray for.
I need some help. Can you do that for me?
In Mark O'Brien's directorial debut, Frederick, who was once a holy man but left the priesthood when he fell in love, calls upon God to bring him penance so that he can atone for the sins that have haunted him for far too long. The Righteous is a movie that I've had on my mind for a few years now because I had never heard of it, and then one day I was browsing through a video store and was drawn in by the artwork on the slipcover, thought the premise sounded interesting, and bought it completely blind, and to this day, it's still the best blind buy I've ever made. Also, the slipcover is certainly nice, but look at the artwork on the case there. Oh my god, I love it. It's so good. Written, directed, and produced by Mark O'Brien, who you may recognize from Radio Silence's Ready or Not, alongside his co-star Henry Czerny, The Righteous is one of the most fascinating religious horror films in recent memory, and yet I've only ever had 3 people mention it in the comments since I started this channel, and I've never heard it brought up in any other context, which is part of the reason I've been itching to talk about it. That's not to say it's gone entirely without recognition, because back in 2021, it actually won Best Screenplay at the Fantasia Film Festival, Best Cinematography and Best Screenplay at Grimmfest, and Best Cinematography at the Blood in the Snow Canadian Film Festival. This low-budget, slow-burn religious horror movie was shot in Newfoundland, Canada, where O'Brien himself is from, with the decision of shooting in black and white being something that, to O'Brien, was never really something he had to consider, but what was instead just inherent to the story that he was telling. It's really fun to get excited about a movie and finally see it and have it live up to all of your expectations or surpass them, but there's something that I love even more about taking a leap of faith with someone's story and having it leave such an impact. I love religious horror, not just because of the visual aesthetic that often accompanies the genre, but also because of the way that it deals with these divine topics in a very tangible way. When someone's regrets or fears can manifest as a face in front of them, that allows for the story to explore that regret in a very confrontational way that, when done well, is absolutely captivating. And The Righteous does it damn well. So let's take a look at this movie that I really think deserves more attention than it gets. The structure of this video, by the way, is going to be a little different, and while I always feel like this, I want to make it very clear, if you haven't seen this movie, please go give it a watch, because I'm just going to be getting into like narrative theories and analyzing the way that this story unfolds in a little more of a, I suppose, more of a narrative way than I usually do. So we're going to be getting into that side of things, and the best way to experience this story for the first time is through your own viewing experience. So go seek it out first.
All little girl, feel a dream, bird street, love to hear the robin go tweet, 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 rockin' robin.
The opening shot of Frederick praying in a black void with the light of heaven spilling on his face has so much to unpack, especially when you get to the final shot of the film and see how they tie together as this sort of call and response. For now, all that's important to know is that Frederick is haunted by something from his past that he has not been able to shake in the 20-some-odd years since it happened. We see him in the inky darkness of his guilt and his shame as he looks to the one thing that he believes can set him free from the memories that are consuming him, that being the brilliant light of God. He asks for his penance to be brought to him so that he can be freed, and the next thing we know, we see him and his wife Ethel grieving the recent death of their young daughter, Joni. We spend a fair bit of time just on Frederick and Ethel, painting a picture of how they're coping with what's happened, and it's also during this time that we learn that Joni was not their biological daughter, but instead someone they adopted from a woman named Doris, who gave birth to Joni at a young age and was not in the position to care for the child.
You never did tell her, right?
No.
While O'Brien was a first-time director, his experience as an actor shows not only in his performance as Aaron, who will come into play later on, but also throughout the entire cast, since him being an actor himself likely made him much more comfortable with directing other actors, especially ones who he'd worked with before and had rapport with, like Henry Czerny. The story is mostly limited to Frederick and Ethel's house, with only a few visitors showing up throughout the film, so there's a pretty tight cast of characters, but there's never any sense that what you're watching is the result of an amateurish set, which can sometimes come from these low-budget films with first-time directors. Doris is the most significant side character, with Kate Corbett's performance doing the very important job of putting the idea of regret and guilt at the front of our minds without delving into Frederick's past too early.
I wasn't the right person for her. Was I?
This naturally draws us to be more curious about what happened with Frederick, and it becomes even more compelling when we learn of his beliefs that Joni's death was his penance that he asked from God, but that he worries there is still more to come.
I'm still left to wonder, is this all? I mean, could it get worse? Is that possible?
So then the question comes up of what the hell could he have done that would make him believe that the death of his daughter was not a substantial punishment? His guilt is at the front and center of the first while of the movie, with him turning down an offer to return to the priesthood and fearing for what else is to come. But what's also very important is his tendency to hide from things, like he's trying to pretend that they aren't there at all. After Ethel begins to cry while the two stand and stare at their daughter's cold bed, Frederick boards up the room like he's locking away the things that are too difficult to face. And in that moment, when he's trying to hide his grief away and shield himself from the reality of what's happened, we get our first hint of the thing that's going to make him face his past very directly. One of the things that makes this such a captivating movie is the constant use of really evocative and thoughtful visual storytelling, where if you're paying close attention, you can get an idea of the direction that things are heading just from the way they choose to frame or block a shot. When Henry hears these yells from the woods growing closer, he goes outside armed with a knife, clearly paranoid about the rest of the punishment that he's expecting. And this is where we meet Aaron, a young man played by O'Brien who shows up outside of Frederick's house, injured and asking for help, but unable to give any concrete answers about what happened or why he's here.
Well, what happened?
I'm lost.
With your foot, what happened to your foot?
I'm lost. I don't know what happened to it.
This scene contains a phenomenal shot that is just about the epitome of show don't tell, because while Frederick does wind up helping Aaron, this shot of him completely bathed in shadow and holding a knife while Aaron lays on the ground injured with the porch light shining on him completely flips what we expect the dynamic to be on its head, making Frederick look like a villain who's hurt the protagonist. Now the movie takes its time to reveal the real reason why Aaron is here, which doesn't come until pretty much exactly halfway through. But in order to properly talk about just how well crafted this all is, I am going to need to get into Aaron's story now. Frederick decides that he wants to help Aaron by allowing him to stay overnight, something that Ethel is reasonably concerned about, but Frederick insists because, well, he doesn't say it. He sees this as a chance to prove to God and himself that he's not a bad person like he feels he has been. This is his shot at redemption. One night turns into many, and Aaron begins to get closer with Frederick and Ethel, and the way that this is all being set up seems to be building up to the ultimate reveal that Aaron has some sinister intention and is planning on harming the couple. Perhaps someone who was wronged by Frederick in the past who's come for revenge, or even just a wandering, crazed man. That assumption even aligns with the core of Frederick's story being about his redemption, because in that situation, perhaps fighting off a threat and keeping his wife from harm could be the way that he finally frees himself from his guilt. But then halfway through the movie, Aaron says this.
I want you to kill me.
This moment is such a head spinner because the movie sets itself up as something much more straightforward, and you may even feel like you know exactly how it's all going to play out, but then this one line flips everything on its head, and it's one of the most memorable oh shit moments I've had in a movie. It feels almost wrong to talk about the motivations here so soon because the movie does such a good job at revealing these things, but in order for me to actually talk about why the execution is so good, we need the context of what's actually going on. We learn later on that Frederick's guilt stems from his time in the priesthood before he met Ethel, where he got a woman pregnant and she died in childbirth, and following this he fled the area and settled down after meeting Ethel, who herself was a widow. Frederick had not only broken his vow of chastity and tainted his worthiness as a priest, but he also knowingly took advantage of the fact that this young woman looked up to him as being closer to God because of his priesthood, and he used that to manipulate her. This, by the way, is one of the reasons that I think Henry Czerny was so perfectly cast for the role, because in order for the movie to fully work, we do still need to be able to empathize with him to some degree, and if he wasn't played with the sort of gentle warmth that Czerny brings, then this backstory would make it really hard to want him to find redemption at all. It's a despicable story where he took advantage of his position and then fled from the reality of what he'd done, and that denial that he has with these hard situations is reflected when he boards up Joni's room earlier on. There are so many examples of Frederick's reactions to certain things in this movie that do a fantastic job of showing how deep his guilt runs. My favorite of which being the scene where Ethel shares a dream that she had about him the night before her husband died, where she was walking in the dark all alone, thirsty and cold, and then from the shadow came Frederick with 2 buckets of water, and she finishes by saying this.
I needed you and you were there. It was like you knew.
So here's Ethel speaking with so much love about a very emotional and intimate dream that she had about how important Frederick is to her, and yet his reaction is one of discomfort. And when we learn about what happened with the young woman who he got pregnant, it's clear that his reaction here is because that young woman also saw him as a God-sent gift to her, and he feels unworthy of something like this, which in a lot of ways he certainly is. It's a reminder to him of how he took advantage of his status, what he's hidden from Ethel, and how he's been looked at as some holy man by people while knowing that he is nothing of the sort. It looks like he almost wants to crawl out of his skin when Ethel says this to him, and it's one of many subtle moments early on in the film that gets recontextualized once we learn the backstory. This dream sequence is an absolutely beautiful and equally tragic scene. As for why Aaron wants Frederick to kill him, this is where things get really interesting. Aaron was the one who hit Joni while she was out riding her bike, apparently pulled by some strange force to do so, and he was then guided to Frederick's house to essentially embody his penance, because he's the son that Frederick abandoned when his mother died giving birth to him, and now Frederick has to make a reality the denial of Aaron's existence and free him from the really bad life that followed him throughout the foster care system and the various health issues he's faced. Frederick's penance isn't just a punishment to him, it's a demand that he give in to the nature that he chose and kill the son who he left behind and ran from out of shame and guilt. Now, there are a lot of questions about what's true in Aaron's story and even in how reliable Frederick's perspective is as our vessel in this story, with his lapses of memory that are brought up many times, raising some eyebrows about what's even real and what's not here, but we'll get more to that later. What's important is that, at least in Frederick's mind, this is the reality of what's happening, and once again, this ties into that fantastic shot of him on the porch painting a picture of what he's going to be tasked with doing. Another piece of visual storytelling that really stood out to me is from a story that Aaron tells about when he was younger and had a fever, and he went to throw rocks into the water to pass time, only to find a large rock that he then picked up and threw with all of his might. And when he did, a catfish came up and was killed by the rock. And afterwards, he says his symptoms went away immediately. On top of that, there's a shot of him miming raising the rock over his head before throwing it, and it very closely mirrors a shot of Frederick praying, which ties Aaron's story in with what Frederick is being told to do here. In order to rid himself of his shame, or of his feverishness, he will have to kill Aaron. The raising of the rock is likened to the prayer, and Frederick will need to throw it and kill the catfish that was hidden under the water for his whole life. These sorts of moments where Aaron is toying with Frederick before revealing his motives are so impactful, especially on rewatch with scenes like this when he's pressing Frederick about his past and being met with the same sort of closed-off nature that we've seen.
When you moved from up north, was it because of a woman?
No. I've been up.
It's chilling to know what's going on here and seeing how trapped Frederick is in this situation. All of these scenes with Aaron have such an uneasy and uncertain feeling to them, with him being very kind and charming and thankful, but always sort of prodding a little further than he should or hinting at something that hasn't yet been revealed.
I gave myself the power to lift that rock, to be late, to have a reason to hate that cocksucking motherfucker.
Now, let's circle back around to that quote that I used at the beginning of this video. Be careful what you wish for, but be certain what you pray for. Aaron's arrival is something that Frederick correctly reads as the coming of his penance, which is why he's so quick to take him in and lie to the police officer and say that he knows him personally.
He's my cousin's nephew. I hadn't seen him in so long, I hardly recognized him.
Now, the true nature of his test is, of course, very different. in fact being the exact opposite of what he'd first thought. But what's actually going on here? Aaron isn't simply his son who decided he was done with life and wanted the man who abandoned him to finish the job, because we also see that there's something supernatural going on here when he touches a flower and it immediately begins to die in one of the most entrancing shots of the whole movie. He says he's whatever is left behind of his son, which could be seen as him feeling like he's been drained of life through his hardship, or it could mean something more. Where things start to develop here is when Frederick begins to worry that this is not penance from God, but instead something else heard his prayer and decided to show up on his doorstep. One thing that comes up a few times in this movie is how widespread sin is, with this conversation Frederick shares with his priest being the biggest point where that's highlighted.
Have you ever sinned? We've all sinned.
Frederick also fights against Aaron's request to kill him by talking about how powerful a sin it would be for a holy man to commit murder.
You know what it means for a man of God to kill even one that's flawed? It means the end of everything. Mankind will be punished.
Going back to Aaron's story about the catfish for a moment, he used a fever in his story in place of Frederick's sins. And when you begin to think about these ideas of sin being so prevalent in society, and we keep in mind that sickness is used analogously for sin, you might notice that everyone in this movie seems to be sick. I promise this will make sense in a second. There's something else that the priest says to Frederick that he's intending to be comforting, but it serves to mean something a little different.
And in so doing, he releases the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But I see sin around me every day. But I don't see any horsemen in the street or bowls of fire in the sky.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are biblical figures, with each of them representing different aspects of the apocalypse, one being conquest, one being war, one famine, and one death, with the idea being that that's the order of events that would lead to the end of all things. Now, Frederick does ultimately wind up killing Aaron by the end of the movie, and when he steps outside after and looks up to the sky, he sees 4 massive fireballs hurtling towards Earth, aiming right at him. Now, we're gonna have to look at this whole thing in 2 different ways. One from the perspective that Aaron actually is connected to something supernatural, and the other being that Frederick is out of his fucking mind. Let's start with the former. So, if God sent Aaron as Frederick's penance, then why in the hell would him doing what he needs to do result in the coming of the apocalypse? Well, as things progress, it begins to seem more that Aaron is in league with something much more sinister. The idea is that Frederick sent his prayer out into the world and it was heard, but perhaps not by God. Something thought it could take advantage of the position that Frederick is in, where he requested punishment and is in a very vulnerable place, and it could well be that they went for Frederick as a way to basically have him commit a sin that would be the straw that broke the camel's back, sending the world that was on the tipping point over the brink. Sin permeates society, but the act of a priest killing his son takes things past the point of no return and brings the apocalypse onto a world that will never find its way back. From that angle, this is a story about a vulnerable and sin-ridden man who's tricked and manipulated, perhaps by the very devil himself. That image of Aaron miming raising the rock also resembles horns growing out of his head, symbolism that's often connected with hell and the devil. Perhaps Satan masked himself as a face that he knew he could use to manipulate Frederick into following along, wanting to bring an end to all things. Maybe this really is Frederick's son, but he was so broken by the weight of life that when the devil reached out to him, he felt compelled to go along with it. Or maybe Aaron didn't even know why he was being compelled to do these things, but his lack of purpose in life made him want to follow it because it gave him something to hold on to. Maybe this isn't the devil, but instead the embodiment of sin, here to confront someone who's hidden so deeply away from his. There are a lot of different ways you can look at this, and it's never blatantly spelled out, but what is clear by the end is that Aaron was very likely not brought here by something good. The other way we can look at the movie is by zeroing in on those mental lapses that Frederick speaks about. And from that angle, it's entirely possible that this whole thing is something that Frederick conjured up in his own mind as a way to try and deal with the suffocating guilt of his past, with his psyche designing this test for him in the hopes that it will be able to break him free from the weight of it all. It's still possible through this angle that Aaron does exist, and was just someone who showed up and needed help, And that's where Frederick's mind began creating this story about who this was. There aren't a ton of concrete details that lean in this direction, but there's one that's so strong that it makes this seem like a very likely possibility. When Frederick goes outside after killing Aaron, he finds Ethel standing with the cops and pointing at him and looking very fearful. Just a moment prior, he had been speaking with her inside, and the way she responded seemed very much like the tone that you'd take if you were feeling like you had to go along with the delusion that someone was having so you could bide time before calling the police.
I love you too.
Frederick experiences one of those lapses in time, and then the police are there suddenly, with Ethel having called them after Frederick killed their visitor who was being cared for and went on rambling with these delusions of grandeur. It's clear that she's the one who called, because she's out with them when Frederick comes outside and points directly at him, seemingly hiding behind them like she's afraid. He also has a vision of Joni at the end here, which implies that while he did go through with his task, he'll never really be able to rid himself of the hardship and suffering of the world. This is something that's true no matter which angle you look at the movie from, and I think it's especially potent because this would be her seeing him covered in blood, showing himself as he truly is, and his daughter seeing the real him is something that he likely hoped would never happen. It's a very haunting and open-ended conclusion, and while there are lots of different ways of looking at it, none of them are particularly happy. It's either the apocalyptic end of times or Frederick is going to spend the rest of his life in jail for murder, leaving Ethel even more alone than she already was. As I said earlier on, these bookends of the movie are a fantastic call and response. It opens with his prayer and it closes with what that prayer brought upon him.
I prayed for my punishment, not the punishment of mankind.
Mankind, who do you think you are? Was it even God you were praying to? Do you even know?
Mark O'Brien's The Righteous is a film that I really wish had more eyes on it and was talked about more because it's an insanely creative, surprising, and well-crafted story that is brimming with passion and inspiration. O'Brien's performance as Aaron is this perfect balance of tragic, haunting, and vague, and the scenes of conversation with subtle nods at what's going on here are absolutely captivating when you realize how much is brewing below the surface. I highly encourage you to seek this one out, and I'm so glad that I decided to randomly pull the trigger on buying it because it's a fantastically well-crafted and thoughtful movie. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.